All right. Well, we were the vision session, which is, obviously setting us up for failure because we're supposed to be big thinkers. We did actually have some big thinking, though. So I think it's fair to say that, by the way, this map up there is one understanding of how we thought about things, but I will try to go through it a little bit more succinctly because there's so much stuff on the map, which is great. But so I think it's fair to say that we thought about standardization issues as being pretty key. But one of the questions that came up very quickly was, what exactly are we talking about when we talk about standards? Because one can talk about standards at a very high level, but every group seems to have a variation of that high-level standard, although it also seemed to be the case that industry tended to be more comfortable with the CDISC standard than academia. So we had some questions about industry versus academia on the standards issue. And I don't think we were supposed to solve anything. We were just supposed to flag things. And so it struck us that this is something to flag, and maybe, especially for academia, but maybe also for industry, what we need, and for less well-resourced industry, so smaller companies and so forth, is templates and examples for people to follow. They might be more comfortable with doing that than a top-down, very directive standard. That ended up leading to a conversation about education and the role of data management professionals, and whether it is the case that data management professionals are considered to be on par with other types of researchers. And that's an educational question that we also didn't fix, but we think it's an important piece of the puzzle to elevate the status, if you will, of data management professionals, because we don't necessarily think that this is true all over the world. In other parts of the world, we were told that meta-analysis is considered a very valuable resource, particularly by government agencies who are thinking about what therapies to pay for and the like. We also had some thoughts about other people's subgroups because people came up with ideas about other people's subgroups, but then we could easily say, oh, we're sure that other subgroup has dealt with that. So we talked about a bit about open source software and its role in all of this and the ways in which open source software could help. We also talked about privacy questions and the ways in which stabilization of privacy frameworks, or at least better understanding of the ways in which HIPAA is perhaps not the obstacle we thought it to be, would be really useful. So I think with that, unless, Bernie, there are other things you wanted to talk about, I will leave it and move over to the next subgroup.
That's not fair. So all of the, this was a really interesting session, and I'll be interested to see what people think about it. The remarkable thing, is this mine? Yeah. So the wonderful thing is none of us looked at this. It just magically appeared the entire time while we were doing it. And, it makes it look like we solved the problem. So just take down the slide because we didn't solve the problem. The problem we were solving was academic credit for data sharing. How do we incentivize data generators who are academic? And, I have to say, it's a challenge, because unless you take let's blow it up and say the realm of publication, first and last, or whatever, is not the realm that we should be evaluating scholarship and promotion, which probably at least 3/4 of the room here would agree with. There isn't an easy solution because we don't have another sort of way of evaluating academic scholarship in real time. Because if we credit the secondary data use, in other words, you contribute it and then you see how valuable is that data down the stream when you're seeing it used for other purposes, that takes years. And the question is that a fair sort of quotient for people to be waiting that long to show that the data that they generated is now being used appropriately? There were a lot of concerns about whether the secondary data user interpreted the primary user data correctly, and that would be a good reason for collaborating with the primary team. The problem there is, who do you actually credit with engaging to solve the questions about the primary data? And is that a way of, sort of further recognizing the PI and maybe one other person who's responsible for data curation or data sharing or data management, or this secondary person? But all of a sudden you got a masthead, if they're masthead authors, as it were, of potentially tens or hundreds of people, if you're doing it, combining 25 data sets, as we'd love to see from Vivli, for instance. There was an idea that in order to encourage collaboration, the primary author, if they're not going to include the secondary data analyst, if they're not going to include the primary author, should pay Vivli or whatever the repository is for the privilege of their having used the data, which to us is not credit. It's solving a completely different problem, right? How do you keep a system sustainable? And that didn't really work. And then finally, I'll say that, one question that we really wrestled with inadequately, as was, the rest of our solution set, is, are we, in all of this sort of talk, are we really addressing two things? One is, how do we value the contribution of less resourced individuals, groups, and countries? And two, this sense that primary authors, primary teams, own the data, which is actually owned by the individuals, not by the people who have collected it. Even though that is a wonderful thing to have done, it's their data. So we've got a problem with this mismatch of what we're asking to what the sort of academic credit really is. So there are some possible solutions. We've proposed some, other people have proposed some. You credit the data set, the primary data sets, with, imprint them with DOIs and follow them, track them through, like we do ORCID, so it's findable, and then the sponsors can also see, or funders, what they actually have paid for, because it's not just the primary author or primary publication, it's the data that then goes on to be used productively, and that's really what we should be caring about. But we don't care about those things, apparently. So we didn't come up with a really rich, brand new idea. Unfortunately, we did see the problems in the way our system is now structured. I think that's a fair rendition of our discussion, but I invite my other colleagues to correct me and be more positive. Usually I'm very positive, but this one seemed to be a little, probably a bigger issue than 1 hour would allow. Anybody? Okay.
All right. We're from the AI panel, and as with the other one, there's a multicolored bubble sheet that we have not looked at. So we focused our discussion, we had some little time on generative AI, but most of it we did a deep dive on a particular use case of secondary data analysis, which is the use of data in a data sharing repository like Vivly or many others to build an AI model, and what kinds of risks there might be in that, and how we should be thinking about that, and what kind of guardrails. So there were some sort of red flags that people felt immediately if there was a proposal to use data to generate a quote-unquote AI model, if it's going to be used for patient care, if it's going to be functioning in a closed-loop fashion, if it's a black box model that we can't interrogate what it is, if it used large language models, because those things are so darn scary, or if the underlying data requires like a lot of understanding of the original data before you can translate into a model, because you need to understand biases, for example. So those are examples of flags that kind of make people go, whoa, whoa, whoa. And maybe if that's the case, that's a situation where there might be a different model of data reuse, kind of like what Barbara was mentioning, where maybe a collaborative approach with the primary data contributor makes more sense, because there's a closer look at biases or managing risk, or maybe even benefiting from value of a model that comes out. So in all that discussion, we kept coming back to the question, but is that really unique to AI models? Why does that red flag not also apply to a statistical model? And while some in the room felt, no, they were all the same, some others felt like, well, maybe, but maybe not. And so where we might want to move forward was to have a process where we systematically look at some of these risks and answer for ourselves in a community, are there different risks? And does that require a different action? Or perhaps these risks are actually fair risks that should also be applied to statistical models. And so a process around building a community consensus around governance structures for how AI intersects with data sharing. And people pointed us to existing efforts that we should look at. Bridge to AI was brought up, because that looks at data generation all the way down to data sharing, and training for that as well. The executive order had a lot of points in there, in 111 or 10, 12 pages or whatever. Coalition for many of these groups don't specifically look at data sharing, but I think that all informs how we might think about governance of data sharing and intersection with AI. And perhaps it's a larger group, and this is exactly the right forum for it. Who are the stakeholders who might come together to generate that consensus set of understanding, and then each of the data repositories can then implement their own approach specifically, so long as we get that sort of overall governance principles down. So I think that's where we came down to. It seems like an action item that we might actually consider as a broader data sharing community.
Oh, this is great. I can even see it on the screen. Now I can even see it better. Okay, so I led the last group, and we were focused on what current regulations and policies are in place that are a barrier to data sharing. So everything on the top that's pink there, those are all the barriers. We had a really nice job of Sienna of separating this out. And so, it's easy to think about your favorite regulation that you hate and point to that one and say that's the barrier. I mean, ultimately, I think the biggest issue that came out was that, and someone used the term mosaic, they used it in a completely different context, but I think it's really appropriate in this context, is that there are a mosaic of rules, and trying to figure out which ones apply under a certain condition is really a challenge. We discussed a little bit, is there one sort of highest level one that if you meet GDPR, for instance, you've met most of the other ones? Yeah, it's probably greater than 50%, who knows what the number is, but there's still other rules that you have to worry about. And so that was really a challenge, is that there is this complexity of different rules and understanding where you're under those guidance and under those rules. That it was really more of the diversity of rules rather than having uniformity. And I was thinking back about the point that was discussed on standards, if we had standards and we knew rules under which people were arguing and essentially starting to process the data, that then might help us identify a single set of rules that then we can guide and follow along. So putting some structure in place instead of it being, as we say in the US, the Wild West, is probably a good thing, even though it will constrain a little bit of the creativity. So we didn't want to just solve the problems, we wanted to go to solutions. So then we got down to the green sections, because that second question we had, are there current policies, regulations that can be used as a model? And so from that, we developed something that I loved. One of our members in our group called, she referred to it and said, well, if you're working in that utopia that you just described, and so Sharon Terry helped us identify a utopia that was very much patient-centric. So patients in the driver's seat, having patients, the individual who has the data, being the person that actually helps determine where it gets shared, how it gets shared, how that might actually be able to promote the rules of sharing and understanding the control over that data. And so we started with that idea to begin with, modeling on something that Sharon is already working on in the rare disease area. And so then from Utopia came Utopia Plus, where then we added on a second component related to, how do we then actually add on additional elements so that we can get over this problem of the constellation of different rules, and what happens if it's a pharma study? Does a pharma company now have to say, oh, I don't have to do it because the patient's now in charge of it, so I'm off the hook? So finding that right balance of Utopia Plus, then we got to Utopia Plus Plus, and we added a few more constraints on it. Finally, we got to Utopia with 3 pluses. But the important thing that I took from it was that all of these new ideas or concerns that we're adding on, none of them negated the foundational part, that you could start from a patient-centric viewpoint. You could start building it from that, and then you continue to build and add on. So you didn't have to solve all the problems at once. You could start with something that was tractable, use it as an example. Devin, said, imagine if we could create this as a test case, and perhaps it's something that we take back to Monica for NIH as they think about what they're going to do on their big data repository. But I think starting from a patient-centric view, the person who generates the data, now all of this question about who's the owner, is it my data, your data, am I the first author or the third author, all that stuff starts to become kind of irrelevant. I personally think, Barbara, it's okay about the academic. That's going to work itself out. I really think that one's going to solve itself. I think it's just going to happen. Well, yeah, they're going to, I think they're going to follow the money, and the money is going to basically drive and answer that question. So that's where it's going to go. So I think if we can get to this state of somewhat of a utopia, really thinking about how do we bring the patient into this? We've not had that person in the room, in that conversation. It was great that we had some representation of patient voices in a number of panels. That might be a good place where we could start something different to think and build from. And so that was probably the biggest take home of this improvisation that I just carried out for you. So thank you.
So first, we want to thank you for coming and for staying to the end. And I don't know how many others of you had your flights delayed this afternoon, so it made it easier to stay. So I just want to set the big picture. So data sharing has really progressed and advanced since the 2015 report. And I think all of you can sort of pat yourselves on the back the way your physical therapist wants you to do, because you're responsible for moving that forward. And a lot of the problems that we were concerned about in 2015 haven't come to pass, and part of it is because of the very hard work that you all have done. Now, obviously, we're moving ahead. There are new things that have come up. Generative AI, IDA, is something we always talk about now. And there's some problems that are still very hard. I mean, if Barbara Beerer is not optimistic about solving the academia a commitment to AI problem, it's a really thorny problem. But I think the biggest optimistic message was hearing from the new FDA commissioner and the new NIH director. They are really strong advocates of data sharing. Both of them expressed eagerness to hear ideas coming from people like the people in this room and online. Doesn't mean they'll always agree with this and implement them as policy tomorrow, but I think there'll be a level of engagement, back and forth, some tough questions, but also a commitment to walking the same path that you all are walking on. So again, I just wanted to thank you and look forward to the next meeting, hopefully a little bit sooner, to do more looking back on our successes and then thinking about the new problems that have emerged since today.
I just want to echo Bernie's sentiments. I just want to think about how much progress we've made and think about maybe we're at an inflection point here. You know, both of them said they would be here today because that is at the top of their agendas for their next administration. So I think that does, and they're really excited about partnering together. So those are things I wanted to share with you. I do think the clip at which we've made progress in the last 5 to 8 years since the IOM report, I'd hope we'd make that same level of progress. I mean, we have new challenges. So we started out this asking, should we set a new North Star? I mean, I think what we've done is set like 12 different North Stars. But I think we can make significant progress, and we have made significant progress. Look how far we've come. So I look forward to partnering with all of you in the room. Thank you for staying. And let's continue this conversation together. So thank you.
And I want to just end by thanking Rebecca and her staff. Julie, you really made this happen. And so this wouldn't have happened without you and your staff.
So I know many of you have to leave, so thank you for staying till the end. I'll be here afterwards along with the staff. So thanks again for all of you who are on the panels, Bernie and everyone else. So thanks again. Talk to you soon.